Chapter 8 The Consequences. Kublai died when Messer Marco Polo was voyaging homeward in the last years of the 13th century of the Common Era. And at the end of this century, a change took place as decisive as the fall of a curtain. Well, after that, you had Ibn Taymiyyah, right? The Mongol empires were penned within their frontiers. The waves of migration out of northern Asia had ceased. For some 2,000 years, the steppe dwellers had marched south and west. Now this human tide had turned back. The invasion of civilized centers had come to an end. In the far west, the Seljuk Turks, driven into Asia Minor by the Mongols, were to move with increasing power into Europe to become the Ottoman Turks, Uthmani, of Constantinople. And in the far east, the Manchus, kinsmen of the Mongols, were to advance from their forests into the Yellow Earth region of North China. But these were isolated currents, the length of the continent apart. The year 1300 of the Common Era marks the full of the tide. Until then, the frontiersman invasion had altered all civilizations in different ways. The greatest danger had been from the Mongol inroad, and this inroad had consequences both rapid and far-reaching. First in China, the lament of the Khakan for Shangtu. Genghis Khan had said that his descendants would eat dainty foods and clothe their limbs in fine stuffs and press lovely women in their arms and forget to whom they owed such things. So it happened in China. Timur, the grandson of Kublai, who reigned after him, had some fine natural qualities. A drunkard and reveler in his youth, he lived a temperate life. When he came to the dragon throne, he passed a law that no one was to be put to death within the empire unless he himself had first passed on the sentence. Officers who allowed their soldiers to loot or damage the crops of the peasants were punished. This quality of mercy was a far cry from the plan of the nomad conquest. In fact, Kublai's descendants were doing the opposite of the earlier Mongol method. Nor was there then any Yao Chao to warn Timur to adhere to military rule and not to surround himself with satellites. Timur had the strength of character to remove from office more than 18,000 mandarins who did not practice the virtues they preached, but he had no one to advise him. Surrounded by rigid ranks of courtiers behind a court routine of ceremony and pageantry, he lost touch with his officers. His only recourse was to favor those who seemed most loyal. He had lost the energy and simplicity of the frontiersman. Heir to 13 dynasties, he was becoming a figurehead of the empire, serving the memory of ancestors not his own. The Buddhists imposed on him in their desire for privileges. Like the sun and moon, they said, the Khakan and the Dalai Lama should hold ascendancy over the earth, not together but in succession. To a Khakan like Mangu, this would have been unthinkable, but Timur had ceased to be a Khakan except in name. He had become a candidate for the title of Son of Heaven, the second of the Yuan dynasty. Not that his days were without glory. The Mongols, who loved music that excited them, had improvised orchestras with stringed instruments and the wailing tribal pipes. Lightness and gaiety transformed the older Chinese harmony of the Confucian odes, and since the Mongols liked to be entertained and not educated by plays, the full-bodied drama of the Yuan dynasty humanized the roles of actors. There were even clowns. Romantic stories were written to be read in court, forerunners of long Chinese novels. The truce that prevailed within the frontier made for enjoyment, and the Chinese, ever quick to seize on it, had their share of it. Timur and his successors were by no means fools of the north. They were simply confined to palace routine. So, with the painter's art, the mysticism of the Sung artists did not vanish under the Yuan. A new realism appeared in it, producing some fine portraits of hermits and emperors, and scenes of the nomad life full of movement and vitality. The galloping horse appeared under the painter's brush as in the vigorous art of the Taung, and the Buddhist influence of mid-Asia crept into the painted figures. In spite of their adaptability, the Mongols could never become Chinese by instinct or make themselves accepted by the Chinese, nor were they able to fit themselves into the Byzantine environment of Taitu. Three things the Chinese never forgave them: the favoritism shown the lamas of Tibet, the foreigners in high office, the breaking down of the Mongol economy. For Timur's generals were Turks and Tangutis. His engineers were Uyghurs and Syrians. His leading merchants, Arabs and Italians. The second collapse of the paper currency led to new devaluation and to heavier taxation. This in turn squeezed the multitudes, for the burden of taxation was passed on by the officials to the mass of the population. Food reserves failed owing to the misconduct of the administrators. Famine was felt again in the south. Floods took their toll. Bands of refugees and rebels settled upon outlying districts like swarms of locusts. Timur's successors lacked the energy of Kublai and Timur. The imperial army was scattered in garrison at frontier points. The outlying steppes were hostile, and the descendants of the multitudinous branches of the Golden Family had become little more than pensioners of the crown. The risings spread through the agricultural south. The reigning Khan gave command to defend the line of the Yangtze, but the barrier of that river had already been crossed. In the south, the leaders of the rebellion had been able to restore order. One of the leaders was Abans, the son of a working man. As usual in China, the poverty-ridden peasantry railed to the new command in expectation of loot, and it became apparent to the rebels that the Mongol yoke could be broken. The Khans, changing as intrigue went on within the palace area, did nothing to restore the Mongol prestige. One of them could organize a fete in honor of Buddha with the musicians and dansuses, and build a pleasure barge on the palace lake in the shape of a dragon with the moving head and tail. While the war of rebellion went on, the Chinese rebels hit upon a slogan: "These barbarians are made by destiny to obey and not to command a civilized nation." Well, true or not, I wouldn't calling people barbarians because they're of a different tribe or language or whatever is not quite the right thing. For the first time, an armed Chinese citizenry was able to gain supremacy from Yunnan to Manchuria. For the first time, they had no need to defend themselves against the nomads of the steppes. When the Mongol officers of the last Khan urged him to defend Taitu, Kublai city, he made his escape without battle into the prairies. On the way, he composed a lament, and this is why the right to bear arms is important, right? Because the government's not there to get rich and to empower itself. It's, supposed to be for the people, by the people, right? Well, that was a phrase not as literal as people think it was, but O thou, my great city of Taitu, O thou, fresh summer palace of Shangtu, great prairie, a green prairie of Shangtu, where I'll start the whole thing over. O thou, my great city of Taitu, O thou, fresh summer palace of Shangtu, green prairie of Shangtu, where the lords of my ancestors lived in happiness, my revered city of Taitu, built without flaw by the power of Kublai, place of never satiating repose, sustaining the rigor of winter and the summer's heat. And you, my grandees and companions, faithful in all your works, my people, simple and well-loved, all these which were my all have been snatched from me. The new dynasty of China proper was called the Ming or Bright. This was in 1370. Within a generation, the armies of the Ming dynasty invaded the steppes, took Karakorum, and defeated the Mongols decisively near Buyar Lake, driving the remnants of them across the Karalan. Seldom, even in Asia, has there been such a complete reversal of power. The Ming expeditionary forces trained in Mongol tactics, cleared the desert frontier with a terrible bloodbath and drove the survivors of the Mongol tribes far beyond the Gobi, where they pressed in turn upon the Chagatai and Oirat groups. The first now converted to Islam. What Genghis Khan had dreaded now took place, deprived of guidance, and with the frontier's civilization closed to them, the surviving nomad tribes began to struggle for the life-giving pasture lands. They were reduced to living again on their herds and in their felt tents. The Chinese frontier armies, now in possession of the area beyond the Great Wall and the oasis around the 5 cities, seized their opportunity to set tribe against tribe. For some 2 centuries, this internecine struggle went on. The effect of the Mongol conquest upon the China of the Ming Dynasty has been disputed. Beyond doubt, it knit together the greater empire that endured until the 20th century. It also increased vastly the contact of this new empire with southern and mid-Asia. The heavy trade of the Yuan period continued into the Ming. Then, too, the Mongols had thrown open the courts and schools to nearly all languages and religions, especially to the Tibetan and to Buddhism. The impact of the Persian, Turkish, Italian, and Uyghur adventurer ministers quickened Chinese thought, and for a while the Ming emperors, succeeding to the throne of the Khans, claimed the sovereignty of a larger Asia. Naturally, a strong reaction against foreigners and foreign thought set in. Tibetans were expelled with the Franciscan missions. To some observers, it seemed as if the new China had been endowed with increased vitality by the invasion. Others hold that the shock of the Mongol conquest exhausted the Chinese spirit and caused its revival under the Ming to be cautious and weak. The vital China of the past becoming imitative, fearful of new invasion, and particularly of the Westerners who now began to arrive on its shores in ships. As before, the life of its civilized centers tended to stagnate. The workers had no period of rest. The farmers had no escape from striving against time and weather. While beyond the Great Wall, the nomads were gaining by degrees, the freedom of life grew stronger physically. Once more, the tribes of the Altai region and Lake Baikal became isolated. They were forced to live again on the meat and the milk of their animals, or to barter for food with the Chinese traders. They thinned out in numbers because they were once more subject to the hardships of an unproductive earth. If they migrated, it was over small areas up toward water or down from the snow. Some of their leaders, like Altan Khan, were able to raid within the Great Wall, but not to unite them again. They separated into wandering ameks. Their mild Buddhism became a barrier between them and the Western clans who were now devout Muslimin. I'm not sure what he means by this, because doesn't he say this before when they obviously weren't by his description? Particularly the fact that they, you question if someone that's using so much of drugs that they can't stay still in prayer. That, I mean, there's worse things in life than drugs, but you know what I mean. That part. But the growing emissaries tended to narrate them. A Chinese, observing them, wrote to his government, "Buddhism forbids the shedding of blood and the doing of harm. That is why this belief should be fostered by all means among the nomads." Meanwhile, the discovery of the ocean routes took trade away from the caravan routes. The old trails through the 5 cities only served from town to town, and the encroaching sands of the Gobi began to cover the half-deserted crossroads cities. The Noyons, descendants of the Golden Family, repeated the name and tradition of Genghis Khan. They had not forgotten the age of their conquests. Some of the Mongols visited in the spring the valley where the graves of the Golden Family had been, where the graves themselves had been lost to sight. No longer did the nomads read the books of Kublai's time. Their life continued without change. In these centuries outside of Central Asia, firearms were being improved and printing presses perfected. Neither arquebuses or books penetrated into the steppes. Nomad life was sufficient without them. The steppe dweller, cherishing his freedom, thought himself to be above the city dweller, who had no respite from work And above the farmer who dared not leave his fields, he still found his contentment in riding over the grasslands on his shaggy pony, his falcon on his wrist. In his mind, the arquebus was a clumsy hunting contrivance, and a book unreadable in any case, a useless thing, unnoticed by him. A change was taking place. The long supremacy of the horse archer had come to an end. The greater physical endurance of the nomad did not give him any advantage over a man with a gun. The mobility of his horse did not accomplish anything for him against cannon and blockhouses. For the first time, and also forever, the balance of power was shifting from the frontiersman to the so-called civilized man, which proved himself more barbaric, right? With the colonial period. What happened in Persia? The ocean-going junk of the Polos was lost at sea more than once. It waited out the monsoon on strange coasts, being long delayed at Sumatra and Ceylon. Of the hundreds of souls on it, only 18 survived the 2 years' voyage up to the head of the Persian Gulf, but the Polos lived, and Princess Kokachin, who had become fond of them, and who, the chronicles say, wept at parting from Messer Marco. The story of that voyage and of his guardianship of the Princess Cathay, Messer Marco never wrote again. He delivered her to the court of the Ilkhans, and because Argun had died during the time of the voyage, Kokachin became the bride of the younger prince, Ghazan. Ghazan, insignificant in person, became the force that separated the Persian dominion from the overlordship of China. Alone of the imperial family, he had refused to let paper money be circulated in the district he ruled. The climate here, he said curtly, is too damp for paper, and it cannot endure, and he burned the banknotes with the printing presses that had been sent to him. When Ghazan became the fourth Ilkhan, he did not put the name of Khan in Cathay on his coins. A man of keen intellect, he understood that the overlordship of the Golden Family had ceased, and that the Mongol military power was a thing of the past. He exerted himself to bring about a truce between the empires, and so far succeeded that his successor could write that the civil war had ceased. Ghazan converted to Islam, built an Islamic state, himself the autocrat. Well, pseudo-Islamic state, obviously, because a religious state is not somewhere where the person dictates their own personal interpretation. It's supposed to go beyond that. An amateur of science, a skilled botanist, chemist, and steelworker, he had patience with neither military pageantry nor with experiments in government. His purpose was to live in peace and develop the caravan route. So obviously an improvement, right? Although he led his great army on Hulagu's path beyond Aleppo, down through Syria to drive the Mamluks back toward Egypt. In this march, he found no trace of the Crusaders who had been driven out of their citadels on the coast of the Holy Land instead of destroying, Rashid says of him. He built up a civilization, and Rashid had reason to praise his lord, for Rashid Din was now a minister of the Ilkhan, laboring at Tabriz with a staff of Chinese and Mongols to write the long history of the family of Genghis Khan, the work that he called the Collection of Chronicles, and from which portions have been translated to be quoted in this book. Rashid, a Persian physician, could not have had access to the leaves of the Golden Book, the secret history of the family which had been entrusted to the sons of Genghis Khan and kept in the Buddhist shrines of the East, but he did have with him as he worked the aged Pulad Chingsang, a Mongol who carried the genealogies of the imperial family in his head, and Ghazan himself knew more of the Mongol saga than anyone except Pulad. Ghazan, while he built palaces and gardens in Tabriz in the mountain region, was more concerned with putting in order a dominion that would last. He forbade armed conflict and prohibited his grandees from confiscating the goods of the peasants. You like to pillage, he told them. But what will ye do when you have driven off the cattle and taken the crops of the men on the land? You will then come to me to be nourished, but you will have only punishment. Impetuous and practical, Ghazan saw no gain in the conquests. He learned from the failure of the Golden Family, and he set himself to make his lands fertile by irrigation works, taxing his people only in proportion to the fertility of their land. But in this vast endeavor, he was ahead of his time. His death ended the protection of the land workers. His successors followed the easier way of leaving administration to a wazir, while they occupied themselves with hunting. They patronized skilled painters, and these learned much from the Chinese who had migrated there with the Mongols, began that new art of the Persian miniature, which is Chinese in origin. Musicians themselves, the Ilkhans, encouraged guitar players and singers, holding tournaments of music because they desired their garden more splendid. They paid the tile makers lavishly. Delicate and whimsical porcelains, fashioned in ray, appeared on their tables. Their gaiety encouraged the poets 2 generations more, and the successors of these Ilkhans had become cup companions with a gift of observing and enjoying life. So it happened that when the Tamerlane came down from the northern mountains, he found a Persia in which all traces of Hulagu had been lost, and Hafiz had been born. Is it Hafiz? At the end. Or is it pronounced differently in Farsi? Ironically, the domination of this southwest of Asia, the House of Hulagu had fostered the very elements which Hulagu had set out from Karakorum to destroy: the religion of Islam, the agricultural Iranian peasant life, and its old heritage of Persian civilization. This heritage had been the enduring life of Persia, joined to Greek artistry in the far distant past. It survived the inroads of Alexander's barbaric Macedonians, the Turks of Mid-Asia, and the Mongols themselves. It survived the degeneracy of its own rulers and the bloodbath of Tamerlane's coming. In the great age of Shah Abbas, it flourished to the full. Today, confined to Persia proper and dominated by the military caste of the present Reza Shah, it still remains characteristic of the nation. The Persians as a whole are agriculturalists and intellectuals. They still read Sa'adi and Hafiz in their desert gardens. And contrary to popular belief, the rise of the Ayatollahs to oust the Shah actually has brought greater and greater freedom for the land. Foreign impositions. It's like, well, if they just obeyed the West, they wouldn't have had those foreign, no. Don't fall for that slander against them. There's problems with the nation nonetheless, but what the Turks did, the Mongol Ilkhans had pushed the Seljuk Turks on into Asia Minor and had added to them various refugee Turkoman clans. So by Ghazan's day, the Black Sea had become a rendezvous of the Turks. No longer curbed by the Crusaders' settlements or the great Mongol armies of invasion, these Turks proceeded to new frontiers, away from the Ilkhans. This migration attack passed around Constantinople into the Balkan ranges, and eventually as far as the gate of Vienna. But the Uthmani Turks, as they came to be called, did not lose the chief characteristics of their ancestors. In their minds, they were still horsemen ruling over subject peoples. Suleiman the Magnificent was a pure Asiatic reigning in Europe. Today, confined to Asia Minor again, they keep their military characteristics and their indifference to culture and traditions of their origin. Under Kemal Ataturk, father of the Turks, they restored emblems of their past, the gray wolf and the blacksmith of the myths. This blacksmith was in fact the figure of a tribal memory of their escape from a slave life in the dawn of history by forging metals from the mountains that hemmed them in, and the minds of the older Turks identified this blacksmith with Kemal Ataturk himself. you know, Kemal Ataturk was a great tyrant, like the biggest tyrant the Turks ever had. But like the Persians, the present-day Turks keep to the national life best suited to them. The emblematic gray wolf and blacksmith have appeared on the new Turkish postage stamps and currency. The present writer was consulted when he visited Istanbul in 1928 by Turkish scholars. They were trying to sketch, under the direction Assemi Bey of the Kath Museum, a shield of arms for the new Turkish Republic. They wanted to combine in this design, as I recall it, the gray wolf's head, a fascist's mace, the blacksmith, and the head of Kemal Pasha, as he was then called, a difficult problem for an artist. On another visit, I discovered that the newspapers of Istanbul were publishing serially translations of my life of Genghis Khan and of Tamerlane, the latter under the heading, "Every Turk should read this life of Timur-e-Lang." It was a part of the government's endeavor to make the people conscious of their past in Asia. But they tried to force a removal of the vitality of their spirituality. They did, they were bringing in a forced everybody the same secularism. So that's otherwise their reforms could have possibly held on better. And the Turkish people and the Armenians and the Kurds and stuff are still having problems as a result of Ataturk. Thank you very much. Central Asia, as with Ghazan in Persia, the death of Kaidu in Mid-Asia in 1301, the Common Era, had deprived the descendants of the Mongols of the personality that held them together. Kaidu had been the last of the house of Ogadai and the last of the true Mongols. He had held to the Yasa of Genghis Khan. The chroniclers say that he was the cause of 41 battles. He died in the saddle after an unsuccessful attempt to recapture Karakorum. If he had lived a generation earlier, Kaidu might have knit the Golden Family together again, but in this time Kublai had become too strongly entrenched in China, and on the other branch had come under the counter-influence of Islamic and Persian culture. They no longer saw a purpose in the nomad empire. And as a side note, because we're talking about people who've become Muslim, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, the Prophet of Islam, as he's called, although Islam is a term for something much older, he was the cause of 43 battles, but he forbade anybody to fight for extending borders, to capture slaves, to capture resources, or to force convert. So he made sure, and he never lost a battle unless a significant number of people disobeyed his command in regards to the battle. Kaidu did maintain the role of the House of Chagatai